Max Reed was an ordinary man living in an extraordinary world, though he did his best to ignore the latter part. At 29, he had settled into a life of routine, one carefully designed to minimize surprises. He worked as a software engineer for a cybersecurity firm, handling code reviews and penetration tests from the comfort of his apartment in Brooklyn. Remote work suited him perfectly. No office politics, no forced socializing, just him and his laptop, with the occasional video call where he nodded at the right moments and spoke as little as possible. It wasn't that he disliked people, he just found them exhausting. His apartment was a reflection of his personality, neat, functional, and devoid of unnecessary clutter. A simple gray couch, a glass coffee table, a bookshelf filled with programming manuals and classic sci-fi novels, a kitchen stocked with the bare essentials. The only decoration, if it could be called that, was an old movie poster of Blade Runner hanging above his desk, a relic from his college days when he still entertained the idea that the future would be sleek and fascinating rather than just another variation of the present. Max had always been a rationalist. He believed in logic, in cause and effect, in the predictability of systems. That was part of what drew him to coding in the first place. The sense of control, of structure. Machines behaved exactly as programmed, unlike people who were frustratingly inconsistent. When others talked about fate or destiny, he dismissed it as wishful thinking. Life was just a series of events, dictated by choice and probability. If something seemed inexplicable, it was only because he didn't yet have all the information. His social circle was small by choice. A few old friends from college he still kept in touch with through sporadic messages, a handful of acquaintances from online coding communities, and his sister, Emily, who made it her personal mission to drag him out of his shell every few months. He endured family gatherings for her sake, sitting through conversations about weddings, babies, and job promotions, all topics that made him feel like an outsider looking in. Relationships, in particular, were something he had never quite figured out. He had dated in the past, but the effort required to maintain emotional connections always seemed to outweigh the benefits. He wasn't heartless. He just preferred things that made sense, and human emotions rarely did. His one indulgence, if it could be called that, was his fascination with old technology, vintage gadgets, forgotten relics of the past, outdated devices that once seemed cutting edge but were now obsolete. He loved them. There was something about holding an old piece of tech in his hands, imagining the lives it had passed through, the purpose it once served. He wasn't sentimental, but he respected history in a way he never could with people. That was why, on a cold November afternoon, he found himself wandering into an antique shop he had never noticed before. Tucked away between a boarded-up bookstore and a laundromat that smelled faintly of detergent and burnt toast, the shop was cluttered and dimly lit, filled with the scent of dust and aged wood. Shelves overflowed with oddities, vintage cameras, pocket watches, typewriters missing keys. Max drifted through the aisles, his fingers brushing against old rotary phones and cassette players, each item a fragment of a world that no longer existed. That was when he saw it. Sitting on a glass counter, half buried under a pile of tangled charging cables, was an old flip phone. It was an early 2000s model, the kind with physical buttons and a tiny monochrome screen. Unlike the other items in the store, which had neat price tags, this one had none. He picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hand, the way it clicked shut so satisfyingly. "That one's been here for years," the shopkeeper said, an older man with glasses that perched on the edge of his nose. "Came in with a box of junk from an estate sale. Never could get it to turn on, but I hate throwing things out." Max hesitated. There was no logical reason to buy it. It wasn't worth anything, wasn't particularly rare, and yet something about it nagged at him. It wasn't sentimentality. He wasn't the type to believe objects carried meaning. But for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he found himself pulling out his wallet. "I'll take it," he said. The shopkeeper shrugged, ringing him up for a few dollars. "No refunds if it doesn't work," he added. Max nodded, slipping the phone into his pocket. He told himself it was just curiosity, just another relic to add to his collection. But as he stepped out of the shop and into the cold evening air, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just done something important. That, for the first time in a long while, he had made a choice that wasn't entirely logical, and that unsettled him far more than he cared to admit. Max didn't think much about the phone at first. It was just another impulse buy, another relic of outdated technology to add to his collection. When he got home, he tossed it onto his desk and forgot about it for the rest of the evening, distracted by work emails and a looming deadline for a security audit he had been procrastinating on. But later that night, as he sat at his desk nursing a cup of coffee, his eyes drifted back to the device. Something about it felt out of place. It was an old model, early 2000s at best, yet it was in remarkably good condition. No cracks on the screen, no significant scratches, just a thin layer of dust that wiped away easily. The battery compartment was intact, and when he pried it open, he found the original lithium-ion battery still inside, against his better judgment, because old batteries had a tendency to leak or even explode. He plugged it into a universal charger. At first, nothing happened. The phone remained dark, unresponsive, exactly what he expected from a piece of technology that had probably been sitting untouched for over a decade. But then, just as he was about to give up, the screen flickered. A dull greenish glow pulsed weakly beneath the scratched plastic cover, followed by a soft vibration in his palm. The boot-up screen appeared, the manufacturer's logo flashing for a brief moment before giving way to the home screen. Max frowned. There was no SIM card inserted, but that wasn't the strangest part. Unlike most old phones that had been wiped or reset after years of disuse, this one still had data on it. The wallpaper was a default factory image, but when he pressed the menu button, he found a handful of saved contacts, old text messages, and even call logs. It was as if the previous owner had just set it down one day and never picked it up again. Curiosity got the better of him. He scrolled through the text messages, half expecting to find mundane conversations about dinner plans or forgotten passwords. Instead, what he found made his breath catch in his throat. Unknown contact. "Max, if you're reading this, it means you found the phone." He stared at the screen, pulse quickening. The message was dated over 10 years ago. That was impossible. He had never owned this phone before, had never seen it in his life. And yet, it addressed him by name. His fingers hovered over the buttons as he hesitantly scrolled further. There were more messages, all from the same contact. The name displayed was just one word: Alan. Ilan. "I don't know if you'll remember me, but please, you have to trust me. Ilan. If they find out you have this, you won't be safe. Ilan." I tried to leave something for you, something to help you remember. Aylan, if you're reading this, it's already begun. Max's mouth went dry. He had no explanation for this, no rational way to process what he was seeing. His first instinct was that it had to be some kind of prank, maybe an old phone that just happened to belong to another Max at some point. But the odds of that were astronomical. Then, before he could react, before he could even begin to make sense of it all, the phone vibrated again. A new message. Real time. From Aylan. You found it. Now they will find you. Max's first reaction was denial. This had to be a prank, some elaborate hoax. Maybe the antique shop owner had rigged the phone, preloaded it with strange messages to mess with whoever bought it. But that theory unraveled almost immediately. There was no way an old flip phone, disconnected from any network, could receive real-time messages. There was no SIM card, no Wi-Fi capability. It wasn't connected to anything. And yet, the message had appeared. He stared at the glowing screen, fingers hovering over the buttons, uncertain if he should respond. His rational mind urged him to shut the phone off, toss it in a drawer, and forget about it. But another part of him, the part that had felt an inexplicable pull toward the device in the first place, wouldn't let go so easily. Slowly, he typed out a response. Max, who are you? He hit send. Nothing happened. The message sat in the outbox, unsent, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe it really was just a glitch, a malfunction in the phone's old software. Maybe the last message had been some kind of time-delayed auto-send, written years ago, but only triggered now when the phone was powered on again. And then, just as he was about to close the device, the screen lit up again. Aylan, you don't remember me, but I remember you. Max's stomach tightened. The words felt strangely personal, carrying a weight he didn't understand. He swallowed hard and typed again. Max, is this a joke? The reply came almost instantly. Aylan, no, you're in danger. They're watching you. Max's hands clenched around the phone. A cold prickle ran down his spine, but he forced himself to think rationally. There was still a chance this was an elaborate trick, some kind of ARG or social experiment. He was a cybersecurity expert. He knew how deep digital manipulation could go. Maybe someone had implanted malware in the phone, preloading it with messages that responded based on an algorithm. But if that were true, how had it used his name? He glanced around his apartment, suddenly hyper-aware of the shadows in the corners. The idea that someone might be watching him was ridiculous, wasn't it? He lived alone. He never left his laptop unsecured, never used unencrypted networks. His webcam was covered, his phone firewalled, his data locked behind layers of security. There was no way anyone could be spying on him. And yet, he felt it now. A presence. A pressure in the air, like the weight of unseen eyes. A new message arrived. Aylan, check your laptop. Max's pulse hammered. His laptop was sitting open on the desk, the screen dark in sleep mode. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and tapped the trackpad. The display flickered to life. At first, everything looked normal. His email inbox, the encrypted drive where he stored client data, the messaging app he used for work. But then, in the lower right corner, a small red dot blinked. The webcam indicator. His blood turned to ice. The webcam was on. But that was impossible. He had physically disabled it, taped over it months ago after one too many stories about hackers exploiting built-in cameras. He reached up to check, peeling back the tiny strip of electrical tape. The lens beneath was exposed. The tape had been removed. He shot to his feet, heart pounding. Someone had been watching him. Someone had been inside his apartment. But how? He locked his doors religiously, had never noticed anything missing or out of place. His security system showed no signs of forced entry. His mind raced, scanning through possibilities. A hidden device? A remote exploit? But that didn't explain the phone. Didn't explain the messages. The screen lit up again. Island. They're already close. If you want to live, you need to leave. Now. A sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Max's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the front door, dread coiling in his gut. It was nearly midnight. No one should be here. He hadn't ordered food, wasn't expecting visitors. The knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. He turned back to the phone, fingers fumbling as he typed. Max, who is at my door? The reply came instantly. Island. Not a friend. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Max stood frozen, torn between the instinct to investigate and the primal urge to run. He reached for his phone, his real phone, ready to dial 911. But just as his fingers brushed against it, the old flip phone vibrated violently in his other hand. Another message. Island. If you call the police, they'll get to you first. His skin went cold. The logical part of his brain was screaming at him to ignore the warnings, to report an intruder like any sane person would. But the other part, the part that had seen his webcam tampered with, that had felt the unseen weight of something watching, was terrified she might be right. A final message appeared. Island. I sent you coordinates. Take the phone. Get out. The screen flickered. A GPS location was displayed, somewhere in the city, not too far from his apartment. The doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to open it. That was all Max needed. He grabbed his jacket, shoved both phones into his pocket, and bolted for the fire escape. Max's breath came fast and uneven as he swung his legs over the fire escape railing and climbed down as quickly as he could without making noise. The cold metal rungs burned against his palms, but he barely noticed. His heart hammered in his chest, drowning out everything else. Behind him, his apartment door rattled again. Whoever was on the other side wasn't knocking anymore. They were trying to get in. He didn't wait to see if they succeeded. The moment his feet hit the pavement, he sprinted. His brain was still catching up, struggling to rationalize what was happening. But his body had already made the decision. Escape first. Question later. The street was nearly empty this late at night. Just the occasional car gliding past, headlights flashing against the rain-slick pavement. Max pulled up the hood of his jacket and forced himself to slow down to a fast walk. Running in the open was stupid. It would attract attention. The old flip phone in his pocket vibrated again. He pulled it out with shaking hands and glanced at the screen. Aylin. Don't go home. They'll be watching it now. His stomach twisted. He wanted to believe this was some elaborate hoax, some mistake, but everything inside him screamed that it wasn't. Someone had been at his door. Someone had removed the tape from his webcam. Someone had been watching him long before tonight. And now he was running from them without even knowing who they were. He needed answers. Max, who are they? The phone stayed silent for an agonizing moment. Then, alien. Not human. Max stopped walking. A chill ran through him, colder than the night air. Not human. That was insane. That was impossible. But so was everything else that had happened tonight. His fingers clenched around the phone. Max, that's not an answer. Island, you don't have time for the full truth. Just know this. They're not people. They don't think like people. They don't leave loose ends. A spike of panic shot through him. Loose ends. That's what he was, wasn't he? An anomaly. A mistake. Someone who had seen too much. But how? What had he done to get their attention? All he had done was buy a damn phone. Or maybe it had found him. He swallowed hard and forced his feet to keep moving, heading toward the coordinates Aylin had sent. They weren't far. Maybe a 20-minute walk if he cut through the back streets. He had no idea what he was walking into, but staying put wasn't an option. He turned down an alley, stepping into the deep shadows between two buildings. The city's noise faded, swallowed by the narrow passageway. His pulse was still too fast, adrenaline making his hands tremble. He needed to calm down, think rationally. Maybe if he... A street lamp flickered above him. Max froze. Something about the movement wasn't right. It wasn't a normal flicker, not the random hum of a dying bulb. It was deliberate, a pattern. The light pulsed twice, then went dark. Then another street lamp, further down the alley, did the same thing. Then another. A cold, electric terror crawled up his spine. He wasn't alone. Max turned sharply, scanning the darkness, but he saw nothing. The alley was empty, silent. Too silent. Even the usual city sounds, distant cars, the hum of neon signs, felt muted, as if something was pressing down on the space around him. The hairs on the back of his neck rose. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but then the shadows moved. Not like a trick of the light, not like his eyes playing tricks on him. The darkness shifted, pulling away from the alley walls like something alive, something trying to separate itself from its surroundings. And then he saw them. Tall figures, barely distinguishable from the shadows themselves. Their outlines were wrong, too smooth, too featureless, as if they had been designed to blend into the dark. When they moved, their shapes wavered, like ink dissolving into water. No faces, no eyes, just silhouettes that flickered like static, glitching at the edges of his vision. They were between him and the street, between him and escape. Max's breath hitched. His fingers clenched around the phone, desperate, terrified. The figure stepped closer. The phone vibrated. Island, run! Max didn't hesitate. He turned and bolted deeper into the alley, taking the only path that wasn't blocked. His legs burned as he sprinted, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The air behind him warped, as if space itself was bending in ways it wasn't meant to. He didn't look back. He didn't want to see how close they were. The alley twisted into a side street, and Max nearly slipped as he turned the corner. The buildings here were abandoned, graffiti-covered and lifeless. No witnesses. No help. The phone vibrated again. Aylin. Left. Now. Max obeyed without thinking, veering into an even narrower passageway between two crumbling buildings. The walls were tight, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. His jacket scraped against rough brick as he forced himself forward. Then, light. A dim, flickering neon sign up ahead. A doorway, slightly ajar. A place to hide. Max lunged for it, shoving the door open and stumbling inside. He barely had time to slam it shut before he heard them outside, the soundless, wrong presence of the things in the alley. The air grew heavier, the temperature dropping. For a moment, he thought they might come through the door, through the walls, through reality itself, but then, nothing. Silence. Slowly, Max backed away from the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned and saw her. A woman stood in the dim light of the room, but she wasn't human. Her skin was faintly luminescent, a soft glow beneath a pale violet hue. Her hair shimmered like liquid silver, moving slightly even though there was no breeze. And her eyes, large, luminous, filled with something ancient and knowing, locked onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch. He knew instantly that this was Aelin. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally she said, "You made it." And behind the locked door, something scraped against the wood. Max stood frozen, his chest rising and falling with sharp, uneven breaths. The room was small and dimly lit, its air thick with the faint scent of something metallic and unfamiliar. Dust clung to every surface, as if no one had stepped inside for years, except for her. The woman before him was unlike anything he had ever seen, and yet, deep in the locked corridors of his mind, something stirred. A recognition he couldn't explain. She was otherworldly in the most literal sense. Her skin, faintly luminescent, glowed with a subtle violet hue, casting soft shadows along the walls. Her silver hair moved unnaturally, drifting as if caught in an unseen current, and her eyes, those eyes, held a depth that felt endless, like twin galaxies burning in the dark. She looked at him, not with fear, not with confusion, but with certainty, as if she had always known he would come. His pulse pounded in his ears as he struggled to form words. "Who?" His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard before trying again. "Who are you?" The question felt absurd the moment it left his lips. He already knew her name. Aelin. The name that had haunted the screen of that impossible phone. The name that had warned him. The name that had guided him here. But knowing a name was not the same as understanding what stood before him. Aelin tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. When she spoke, her voice was smooth, melodic, but tinged with something weighty, something heavy with meaning. "You don't remember me," she said softly, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Not yet." His skin prickled. "I've never met you before in my life." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her gaze, something almost like sadness. "That isn't true." Before he could respond, before he could demand an explanation, a sound from outside the door made every muscle in his body lock up, a slow, deliberate scrape against the wood, a whisper of something shifting just beyond the threshold. His breath hitched. Aelin's eyes darkened. "They found you faster than I expected." Max took an unconscious step back, his mind racing. "Who are they? What do they want?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved, with a sudden grace, crossing the small distance between them in a single step. Before he could react, she reached out and pressed her palm against his forehead. A sharp, electric sensation shot through him, like static crawling beneath his skin. His vision blurred. Images, fragmented, disjointed, flashed through his mind. A darkened sky filled with unfamiliar stars, A feeling of weightlessness, of floating in the void. A voice, hers, calling his name in desperation. Cold metal beneath his fingers. A chase, running, hiding. Something was being erased, stripped away piece by piece, reality breaking apart at the seams. Then nothing. A blank void. A silence so deep it felt like drowning. Max staggered backward, gasping as the sensation vanished. His knees nearly buckled, and he reached for the nearest surface to steady himself. What? He choked on his own words, his head spinning. What the hell was that? Aylin's expression was unreadable. A fragment, she said, of what they took from you. His fingers dug into the edge of a rusted metal table, his entire body trembling. No, that's... He shook his head violently. That's impossible. You don't believe me, she murmured. There was no accusation in her tone, only certainty. Of course I don't. Max's voice rose, edged with panic. This is insane. You're telling me I knew you? That I, what? Lost my memories? That I'm being hunted by what? Shadow monsters. You saw them yourself? She said simply. He had no response to that. The scraping at the door came again, louder this time. A single, deliberate knock followed, slow and rhythmic. Not the frantic pounding of an ordinary intruder, not the hesitant rap of someone uncertain. This was different, measured, a statement, not a question. They don't like waiting, Aylin said quietly. Max turned to her, his pulse hammering. Then we need to go. Right now. Aylin didn't move. They've already surrounded the building. Running will only delay the inevitable. He felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. So what? We just sit here and wait for them to come in? She finally looked at him again. And this time, there was no sadness in her expression, no hesitation, only steel. No, she said. We fight. Max barely had time to react before the door burst open. Max's vision fractured. The world around him collapsed into a storm of color and sound, twisting in on itself like a film reel burning from the inside out. The floor beneath him ceased to exist, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he was weightless, falling through a void where time lost meaning, where his own body felt like little more than a memory. Then, with a force that nearly knocked the breath from his lungs, reality snapped back into place. He hit the ground hard, knees slamming against cold metal. The impact jarred every bone in his body, but the pain was distant, muffled beneath the overwhelming flood of sensation that crashed over him. The air smelled different, sterile, metallic, laced with something sharp and electric. The dim, flickering light cast jagged shadows against smooth, unnatural walls. This wasn't the room he had been in. This wasn't anywhere on Earth. His hands trembled as he pushed himself up, his head spinning. He knew this place. He didn't know how, but he did. A deep, gut-wrenching familiarity clawed at his mind, like something long buried fighting its way to the surface. The sensation was unbearable. Memories just out of reach, slipping through his fingers like water. He gritted his teeth, trying to force them to take shape, but the harder he reached for them, the further they pulled away. A hand grabbed his arm, steadying him before he could collapse again. He turned, his breath catching as he met Aylin's gaze. But she wasn't just looking at him. She was searching, waiting, as if expecting him to say something, to remember something vital. This place... His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. I know this place. Her grip on him tightened. Yes. The word sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't a confirmation. It was a reminder. He forced himself to take in his surroundings, his heartbeat pounding against his ribs. The room was large, but empty. Its walls smooth and pulsing faintly with veins of light that ran like circuitry beneath the surface. There were no windows, no doors, only a single terminal embedded into the far wall, its screen flickering erratically, displaying symbols that made his head ache just looking at them. Panic curled in his chest. Where the hell are we? Aylin didn't answer immediately. Instead, she released his arm and moved toward the terminal, her fingertips ghosting over the interface. The screen responded to her touch, shifting, stabilizing. She exhaled slowly. We're at the crash site. Max blinked. The words made no sense. Crash site? What crash site? Aylin turned to him, her expression unreadable. Your crash site. Max's breath hitched as her words settled in his mind like a slow-moving toxin. Your crash site. The statement didn't make sense. He had never crashed anywhere. He had never been in a crash, period. He was just a guy from Brooklyn, a programmer, someone who spent more time staring at lines of code than interacting with the real world. But the way Aylin said it, the certainty in her voice, it rattled something loose inside him, something buried deep, just out of reach. He turned away, his hands pressing against the cold metal floor, his fingers digging into the smooth surface as if he could anchor himself to reality. No, he muttered, shaking his head. That's not possible. I don't belong here. The words felt weak, fragile, even as he said them. The room disagreed. The air disagreed. And the pounding in his skull, the sharp, splintering sensation of something unraveling in his mind, that disagreed most of all. Aylin was watching him, silent, unreadable. She wasn't trying to convince him, wasn't trying to argue. She was waiting. Max forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. You keep saying I don't remember, he said, his voice unsteady. So tell me what I forgot. Aylin's gaze didn't waver. It's not that simple. Try me. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then she exhaled slowly, and when she spoke, her voice was softer, like she was peeling back something fragile. You weren't always Max Reed. You were someone else before, and before that, someone else. Every time, they erased you. They took everything, your past, your name, your existence, and rewrote you into something new. But the cracks are still there. Pieces of you remain, scattered and buried. This place, she gestured around them. This is one of those pieces. Max's stomach twisted. You're saying I've lived multiple lives, that my memories have been erased over and over? The idea was absurd. It sounded like something out of a bad sci-fi novel. And yet, a part of him wasn't rejecting it outright. A part of him recognized the truth in her words, even if his conscious mind still fought against it. Aylin stepped closer, her bioluminescent skin casting shifting shadows along the walls. They don't just erase memories, she said. They erase existence. They rewrite the past itself. The people you knew, the places you've been, none of it exists anymore. To them, you're an anomaly, a mistake they've tried to correct again and again. His chest tightened. Then why am I still here? Her expression darkened. Because something went wrong. A chill crawled up his spine. What do you mean? Aylin hesitated, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked uncertain. You were supposed to be erased like all the others, but something about you resisted the process. Something deep, something they couldn't fully wipe away. This crash site, this place, it's proof that you existed before, that they failed. Max's mind reeled. He turned, looking at the pulsing walls, at the strange, alien terminal that flickered erratically under Aylin's touch. It was impossible, all of it, but at the same time, the pieces were clicking together, forming a picture he didn't want to see. The impossible familiarity of this place. The way the world around him had always felt off, like a dream slightly out of sync with reality. The phone, the messages, the things that had hunted him in the alley. He had spent his whole life believing the world was logical, structured, explainable. But what if it wasn't? What if the truth was something far worse? Aylin's voice pulled him back. They're still trying to erase you, Max. They've been closing in ever since you activated the phone. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was letting you survive this long. A pulse ran through the walls, a deep, almost imperceptible vibration that sent a fresh wave of unease through him. He turned to Aylin, his throat dry. Then what's their next move? She didn't answer immediately. Then slowly she reached out and placed a hand over his, the warmth of her touch grounding him, even as everything else threatened to spiral out of control. They won't stop until you're gone completely, she said. But now, for the first time, you have the chance to fight back. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the walls, low and steady, like a pulse in the very fabric of reality. Max felt it in his bones, a pressure building beneath his skin, tightening around his ribs. The air in the room grew heavier, charged with something unseen, something wrong. He didn't need Aylin to tell him what was happening. He could feel it. They were coming. His fingers curled into fists. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room had no doors, no windows, only the pulsing walls and the strange, flickering console that Aylin had been manipulating. This place, his supposed crash site, was a dead end, or worse, a trap. Aylin's expression was unreadable as she pressed her palm against the terminal again, lines of alien code shifting beneath her touch. They've locked onto this location, she said, voice steady but tense. They're destabilizing it. If we don't act now, we won't exist long enough to escape. Max swallowed hard, forcing down the rising panic clawing at his throat. What do we do? She didn't answer immediately. The screen in front of her flickered wildly, symbols rearranging in rapid succession, a process he couldn't begin to understand. Whatever she was doing, it was fast, desperate. The phone, she finally said. It's the only reason you remember anything. It's the only proof that you exist outside of what they tried to rewrite. Her gaze snapped to him, sharp and full of meaning. It's an anchor, Max, and right now, it's the only thing keeping you real. His grip tightened around the device in his pocket, its edges biting into his palm. An anchor. The word sent an involuntary shiver down his spine. He had thought of the phone as a mystery, a problem to solve. But now he saw it for what it really was. A tether to something bigger. Something they had tried to erase but hadn't been able to fully destroy. The hum in the walls deepened. The space around them flickered, distorting at the edges, as if reality itself was beginning to come apart. Aylin's movements grew more frantic. They're accelerating the collapse, she said. We need to go. Now. Max's breath came fast and uneven. Go where? You said there's no way out. Aylin turned sharply, eyes burning with an intensity that sent his pulse skyrocketing. There's always a way out. Before he could respond, the world around them twisted. The walls bent inward, not physically, but conceptually, their very existence unraveling in jagged, glitching patterns. The hum turned into a deep, resonating crack, a sound so unnatural it made his vision blur. The air ripped, and in the space where the far wall had once stood, darkness poured in. Not shadows, not emptiness, something else. A void that devoured light, devoured space, devoured everything. Max staggered back, heart hammering in his chest. "Aelin!" "I know," she snapped. "Hold on to the phone. Whatever happens, do not let go." The darkness surged forward. It moved without moving, a thing without shape, and yet its presence was suffocating. Max's mind recoiled, instincts screaming in protest, every nerve in his body telling him that this was wrong, that this was death in its purest form. His grip on the phone turned vice-like. Then Aelin reached for him. The moment their hands touched, the world fractured. Not like before. Not like the cascading rush of memories or the disorienting shift between locations. This was something else. A collision of realities, slamming together like two opposing forces that were never meant to meet. Light exploded outward, violent and blinding, as if the universe itself had been torn open. For an instant, Max wasn't anywhere, and then he was falling. Max was falling, but there was no ground, no sky, no sense of direction, only motion, endless and unstoppable. The world had been torn away, and in its place was a maelstrom of light and shadow, shifting too fast for his mind to process. His body wasn't his own anymore, weightless and untethered, as if he were nothing more than a fragment of thought, caught in a current that didn't belong to this universe. He clutched the phone like a lifeline, fingers cramping from the sheer force of his grip. Somewhere beyond the chaos, Aelin was with him, her presence the only thing grounding him in whatever this space was. The sensation wasn't just falling. It was being pulled, dragged through something vast and incomprehensible, a place that wasn't a place at all. There were glimpses of things in the periphery of his vision, impossible things, echoes of cities that had never existed, faces that flickered like distorted reflections on water, structures that built themselves and collapsed in the same instant. He had the overwhelming sense that he was moving through layers of reality, through the remnants of something that had been erased, rewritten, unmade. Then suddenly, the force released him. He hit the ground with a brutal impact. The air punched from his lungs. The world around him was a blur of static and shifting shapes, his senses struggling to catch up. His fingers were still locked around the phone, its surface hot against his palm. He gasped, rolling onto his side, his body aching from the collision with solid ground. But this ground wasn't the crash site. It wasn't anywhere he recognized. He forced himself up, his vision clearing, and what he saw sent a jolt of horror through his system. The space around him was wrong. Buildings stretched in impossible ways, streets folding in on themselves like paper being crumpled and smoothed out again. The sky wasn't a sky at all, but a vast empty expanse filled with distant shapes that flickered in and out of existence. And in the center of it all, standing motionless like statues, were them. The figures. The ones that had chased him. The ones that had been erasing him piece by piece. They were waiting. Not moving, not advancing, just waiting, as if they knew he had nowhere left to run. Aelin stumbled beside him, breathing hard, her silver hair still shifting as if caught in an unseen tide. She steadied herself, then looked at the scene before them, her expression unreadable. "They forced us into a collapsed fragment," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "They've sealed the exits. We're at the final threshold." Max's pulse pounded. "What does that mean?" She turned to him, eyes burning with something fierce. "It means this is it. They won't let you escape again. Either you take back what they erased, or you disappear forever." The figures began to move. Not walking, not stepping, shifting. Their bodies flickered like broken signals, their outlines distorting as they started closing in. The space around them warped, the air itself pressing down, heavy with something he couldn't name. His breath caught in his throat. Aelin grabbed his wrist. "Listen to me," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. "The phone. It's not just a link to your memories. It's the last real proof that you existed before they erased you. As long as you hold on to it, you are still real." Max felt the weight of it in his palm, the way the heat of it pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. He understood now. This wasn't just about remembering. This was about reclaiming something that had been stolen. The figures closed in, the space collapsing further. Aelin's fingers tightened around his. "You have to choose, Max. If you let them take this from you, you'll be erased. Completely. No coming back. No trace left behind." The phone screen flickered. Images pulsed across it. Flashes of things he almost recognized. His own face, but not as he knew it. A world that felt familiar, yet wrong. Moments that had happened and not happened. All fighting to be real again. The figures were feet away now. Reality buckled. Aelin's voice was fierce, unwavering. "Take back your existence." Max looked at the phone one last time, then made his choice. Max's fingers tightened around the phone, his pulse hammering in his ears. The world around him was collapsing, unraveling like a glitching simulation on the verge of total failure. The figures, the ones who had hunted him, erased him, rewritten him, were closing in, their forms flickering, shifting between what his mind could process and something far worse. He could feel them pressing against the fabric of reality itself, pulling it apart, twisting it into something they could control. If they reached him, if they touched him, it would be over. He would be nothing. Not dead, not forgotten, just gone. Aelin's grip on his wrist was the only thing keeping him grounded. Her presence burned like a tether in the storm, an anchor in the chaos. "Max," she said, her voice cutting through the static of the world breaking apart around them. "You have to do it now." His hands were shaking. The phone screen flickered, erratic symbols racing across it, a rapid sequence of images and code that made his brain throb with something deep and unspoken. He saw flashes of things that had been stolen from him, a skyline he didn't recognize but knew he had once stood beneath, faces that stirred emotions he couldn't name, a ship drifting through the void, his hands on the controls, a life, 1,000 fragments of it, scattered and buried beneath layers of manufactured nothingness. They had taken everything from him, but something inside him had resisted. Something had held on. The figures surged forward. Aelin moved, stepping in front of him like a shield, but even she couldn't hold them off. The space around them bent, warping under the force of whatever the figures were doing. The sky above them cracked open, and Max saw nothing beyond it. True emptiness, Not darkness, not void, but the absence of anything at all. He felt his mind recoil, every cell in his body screaming that this was not something a human was meant to witness. The figures weren't attacking with weapons or brute force. They were rewriting the rules of existence itself, reshaping the world so that he had never been. Max gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus on the phone. It was the key. It was the only thing tethering him to something real. His thumbs moved before he could second-guess himself, pressing against the flickering screen, navigating menus that shouldn't exist, symbols that weren't in any language he should have known but did. His body remembered what his mind had forgotten. A prompt appeared, glowing against the shaking, shifting background of the collapsing world. Reclaim self? Yes. He hit the command. The world broke. A shockwave exploded outward, rippling through the space around him, tearing through the figures like a firestorm consuming dry paper. They flickered violently, their forms distorting, their bodies unraveling like data being forcefully deleted. The sky above them twisted, and suddenly, the nothingness wasn't nothing anymore. Colors bled through, stars piercing through the void, constellations that had no place in the reality he knew. But he did know them. His memories came flooding back, crashing into him with the force of a tidal wave. He had lived before. He had been more than Max Reed, more than a man from Brooklyn with a mundane life. He had been someone else, many times before, each version of himself stolen, rewritten, erased. He had traveled further than any human should have, seen things that no one else had seen, touched the edges of the universe, and left something of himself imprinted there. And they had feared him for it. They had tried to remove him from existence again and again, but something in him had resisted, fought back, refused to be erased. Now, he was fighting back completely. The figures let out a sound, not a scream, not a word, but something deeper, something older, a distortion in the fabric of space itself. They were losing control. The reality they had crafted around him was unraveling, and they couldn't hold it together. Max felt himself stabilizing, solidifying in a way he hadn't realized he had been missing. His mind, his past, his existence, it was his again. Aylin turned to him, her silver hair crackling with energy, her expression fierce. It's working. Max barely had time to process what she was saying before the ground beneath them lurched. The world was coming apart, but not in the way the figures had intended. Their control was slipping. The space they had sealed him in, rejecting their influence. Max felt himself being pulled forward, out, back towards something real. He had won. The last thing he saw before the collapsing reality swallowed the figures whole was their flickering, empty forms glitching into nothingness. The world was breaking, but this time it was breaking for him. The figures that had hunted him, erased him, rewritten him, they were unraveling, their control slipping like sand through his fingers. The space they had trapped him in, this fractured pocket of stolen existence, was rejecting them now. Max could feel it, feel the shift in reality, feel himself being pulled towards something real, something his. Aylin was beside him, her bioluminescent skin flickering as energy crackled through the collapsing air around them. She was watching him, waiting, not with fear, not with doubt, with certainty. He had made his choice. He had taken back his existence. And now, there was only one thing left to do. The ground beneath them wasn't solid anymore. It pulsed, shifted, bending like liquid light. The sky was no longer empty, but filled with something vast and unknown. Galaxies swirling, constellations aligning, points of light that had been lost but were now returning. Max didn't recognize them, and yet he did. They were places he had seen, stars he had once known. The weight of lost time pressed against his chest, but he didn't let it crush him. This wasn't about the past. This was about reclaiming the future. The last remnants of the figures flickered before him, their forms barely holding together, their presence thinning like smoke in the wind. They had no faces, no voices, but he could feel their desperation. They had spent so long keeping him contained, keeping him small, and now, for the first time, they had failed. He could see the truth now. He wasn't just some anomaly they had tried to erase. He was something they feared, because he had resisted, because he had survived. Ilan reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. The moment their fingers intertwined, the space around them gave way. The final lock on his existence shattered, and the force of it pulled them forward, through the breaking fabric of this false reality and into something new. A flash, a rush of air, a sense of motion, and then stillness. Max staggered, his knees nearly buckling as his feet found solid ground. The sensation was overwhelming. The weight of being real again. The world around him was no longer breaking. It was whole. And so was he. He exhaled shakily, glancing at Aylin. She was watching him, searching his face. "You did it," she murmured. "You chose to exist." Max looked down at the phone in his hand. The screen was dark now, the flickering symbols gone. Whatever had kept him tethered to his erased past had done its job. He wasn't a shadow anymore. He was here. And they, whoever they were, couldn't change that. Aylin took a step closer, her voice softer now. "They'll come again. They always do. But now you remember, Max. Now you know." He met her gaze, the weight of everything settling in his chest. He had lost so much. So many lives. So many versions of himself. But this time, he wasn't going to run. This time, he wasn't going to forget. For the first time in longer than he could comprehend, Max Reed truly existed, and he wasn't going to let them take that away ever again. Max opened his eyes to the quiet hum of his apartment. The air smelled the same, coffee, the faint scent of rain drifting in from the open window. His desk sat undisturbed, his laptop screen dark, his books stacked neatly on the shelf. It was as if nothing had changed, as if the nightmarish unraveling of reality had never happened. But he knew better. He felt different, more solid, more real. The weight of 1,000 stolen memories still pressed against his mind. Pieces of past lives flickering just beneath the surface. He didn't know how long it would take to sort through them, to understand the full extent of what had been done to him. But for the first time, the choice was his. No more erasures. No more rewritten history. The old flip phone lay on his desk, dark and lifeless. Whatever power it had held, whatever tether it had been, was gone now. But as he reached for it, his fingers brushed against something colder, smoother. A small silver disc, etched with symbols he suddenly recognized. A message, a reminder. He wasn't alone in this. Ilan was out there. And so were they, the ones who had erased him once and would try again. But this time, he would be ready. Max sat at his desk, the weight of reality settling over him like a storm about to break. The world outside his window looked the same. Cars moving through the streets, neon signs flickering in the rain, people walking by. unaware of how close their reality had come to being rewritten. But Max knew. He could feel the difference in his own existence, like a weight he had never noticed was gone. His memories were still fragmented, pieces floating just beneath the surface, waiting to be put back together. But this time, they were his. The flip phone remained dark, lifeless. Whatever connection it had held to his erased past was severed. He should have felt relieved, should have felt free. Instead, unease curled at the edges of his thoughts. They had lost, but that didn't mean they were gone. If they had rewritten him before, they could try again. The difference was, now he would see them coming. His real phone vibrated against the desk, the bright screen a sharp contrast to the dead weight of the old device. A single message, no number, no sender, just 2 words. "I'm here." Max's breath hitched. He turned slowly toward the window, his reflection staring back at him through the glass. But for the briefest moment, just before the neon lights flickered, he wasn't alone in it. Elan's eyes met his through the glass, glowing with quiet certainty. And then she was gone. Max exhaled, a slow, steady breath. They would come again. But this time, he was ready.